At 7:42 a.m. on March 23, 1945, First Lieutenant Raymond Ray Corcoran was flying his L-4 Grasshopper at 800 feet over the Rhine River when a German sniper put a bullet through his engine. 26 years old, 14 months in the artillery, zero flight training before the war. Ray hadn't planned to be a pilot. He'd enlisted in 1942 as a field artillery forward observer, one of the poor bastards who crawled up to the front lines with a radio and a pair of binoculars, called in fire missions, and prayed the Germans didn't spot them before the shells landed. He'd spent 6 months in North Africa doing exactly that, hugging the dirt, while 88mm rounds screamed overhead, whispering coordinates into a handset while German machine guns stitched the ground around him. Then, in Sicily, a colonel had noticed that Ray could read a map faster than anyone in the regiment. That same colonel had been trying to get artillery observation pilots for months. The air forces couldn't spare trained aviators for such unglamorous work, and the artillery was desperate for anyone who could fly and observe at the same time. "Can you fly a plane?" the colonel had asked. "No, sir," Ray had replied. "Can you learn?" "I suppose so, sir." "Good. You start Monday." The training had been 6 weeks at a muddy airfield in Morocco, enough time to learn takeoffs, landings, and how not to stall the engine in a turn. Ray's instructor, a crusty National Guard captain who'd been flying since Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, had summed up the curriculum on the first day. The Grasshopper's not a fighter. It's not a bomber. It's a telephone pole with wings. Your job is to get up there, stay up there long enough to see something useful, and get back down without crashing. Everything else is extra credit. Ray had turned out to be a natural. Not a great pilot, not by any standard, but good enough. He could take off in a crosswind, land on a road that was barely wider than his wingspan, and keep the little plane steady while he scanned the ground below with binoculars. More importantly, he could read terrain, estimate distances, and translate what he saw into grid coordinates that made sense to the gunners. By the time the 285th Field Artillery reached France in September 1944, Ray had flown over 100 missions. He'd spotted tanks, troops, supply convoys, and artillery positions. He'd called in fire that had destroyed bridges, ammunition dumps, and at least one German regimental headquarters. He'd been shot at more times than he could count, and he'd developed the instincts of a prey animal, always watching for the glint of a rifle barrel, the muzzle flash in the trees, the tracer rounds arcing up toward his fragile little aircraft. The L-4 Grasshopper wasn't really a combat aircraft. It was a Piper Cub with olive drab paint, a fabric-covered 2-seat puddle jumper that civilians used to learn how to fly on Sunday afternoons. It had a 65-horsepower Continental engine that could push the little plane to about 85 miles per hour if the wind was favorable. It carried no weapons, no armor, no radio that could reach more than a few miles. It was the aerial equivalent of a bicycle. The cockpit was so small that Ray's knees pressed against the instrument panel. The instruments themselves were minimal: airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, oil pressure, fuel gauge. The control stick was between his legs, the throttle on the left side of the cockpit, the rudder pedals at his feet. Behind him, the observer's seat was usually empty. Most missions didn't require a second man, and the extra weight reduced the plane's already marginal performance. The fabric skin of the aircraft was so thin that Ray could push his finger through it if he wasn't careful. He'd seen planes come back with holes you could read a newspaper through. Holes that hadn't affected the flight at all because there was nothing structural in those places to damage. The Grasshopper was almost more air than airplane, which was both its weakness and its strength. Bullets passed through without hitting anything vital. But the engine was another matter. The Continental A65 was a 4-cylinder, air-cooled engine that produced exactly 65 horsepower at full throttle. It was reliable, simple, and almost completely exposed to enemy fire. The engine cowling was thin aluminum that wouldn't stop a pellet gun, let alone a rifle bullet. If a round hit the cylinders, the crankcase, or the oil lines, the engine would fail within seconds. Ray had always known that his luck would run out eventually. He just hadn't expected it to happen 20 minutes into a routine mission, with the war almost won. But the Army Air Forces had discovered that the Grasshopper was perfect for one particular job: artillery observation. A pilot could fly low and slow over enemy positions, spot targets, and radio corrections back to the big guns behind the lines. Where a fast fighter would be past a target before the pilot could blink, the Grasshopper could circle, observe, and adjust fire with precision that made every shell count. The Germans hated the Grasshoppers. They called them storks because of their long, thin wings, and they'd learned that wherever a stork appeared, artillery fire would follow within minutes. German soldiers would shoot at the little planes with anything they had: rifles, machine guns, even pistols. Most of the time, they missed. The Grasshopper was a small target, and shooting at a moving aircraft with a rifle was harder than it looked. But sometimes they hit. Ray Corcoran had been hit 3 times in 14 months. The first time, a rifle bullet had punched a hole through his left wing that he could stick his fist through. He'd flown home and had it patched. The second time, a burst of machine gun fire had shattered his windscreen and cut a gash across his forehead that still showed as a thin white scar. He'd flown home, gotten stitches, and gone back up the next day. The third time was different. The third time, the bullet went through his engine. If you're new to WW2 Tales, welcome. This channel covers the incredible true stories of ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances during the Second World War. We upload every week, so subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And stick around to the end of this video, because what Lieutenant Corcoran did after he landed would turn a routine observation mission into one of the most unusual artillery strikes of the entire war. The mission that morning was supposed to be simple. The 285th Field Artillery Battalion was supporting the 89th Infantry Division's crossing of the Rhine at Oberwiesel. The infantry had gotten across during the night, but they were pinned down on the east bank by German artillery dug into the hills above the river. The American guns couldn't hit the German positions because they couldn't see them. The hills blocked the line of sight from the west bank, and the infantry on the east bank was too busy staying alive to send back accurate coordinates. That's where Ray came in. His job was to fly over the German positions, identify the artillery emplacements, and radio their locations back to the 285th. The American 155mm howitzers would do the rest. It was the same job he'd done 100 times before: circle, observe, call in the fire, go home for breakfast. The problem was the approach. To see the German guns, Ray had to fly over the east bank of the Rhine, which meant flying over German-held territory. The hills on that side were crawling with enemy troops, and they all had rifles. Flying at 800 feet, he was well within range of aimed small arms fire. He'd planned to make a single fast pass, note the positions, and get out before the Germans could react. But the morning mist over the river had been thicker than expected, and he'd had to circle twice to get a clear view. By the time he spotted the German artillery, 4 105mm howitzers dug into a ravine about half a mile from the river, he'd been over enemy territory for almost 3 minutes, long enough for a German sniper to draw a bead on his engine. The shot came from somewhere in the trees below. Ray never saw the muzzle flash. He just heard a crack, felt the Grasshopper shudder, and watched his oil pressure gauge drop to 0. "Oh hell," he said. The Continental engine ran for another 15 seconds on the oil still in the lines. Then it seized. The propeller stopped spinning. The engine coughed twice, shuddered, and died. And Ray Corcoran found himself gliding over German-held territory in a powerless aircraft with no chance of making it back across the Rhine. A Piper Cub without power has a glide ratio of about 8-to-1, meaning it drops 1 foot for every 8 feet it travels forward. At 800 feet, that gave Ray about a mile of gliding distance. Not nearly enough to reach the American lines. He had 2 choices. Option 1, bail out. The Grasshopper didn't have a parachute, but at 800 feet, he might survive a jump if he timed it right. He'd land in German territory, become a prisoner of war, and spend the rest of the conflict in a stalag. Bad, but survivable. Option 2, land the plane. Find a field, put it down, and hope he didn't hit a tree or a ditch or a German machine gun nest. If he survived the landing, he'd still be in German territory with no weapon except his .45 pistol and no plan except to hide and wait for the American advance to overrun his position. Also bad, also survivable. Ray chose option 2. He'd never liked the idea of jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, even a perfectly good airplane that wasn't moving anymore. The field he picked was a winter wheat pasture about 400 yards from the ravine where the German artillery was dug in. It was long enough for a landing, mostly flat, and, as far as he could tell from the air, unoccupied. He came in low over the hedgerow at the near end, held the stick back to bleed off speed, and touched down in the softest landing he'd ever made. The grasshopper rolled to a stop about 50 yards from a stone farmhouse. The house looked abandoned, shutters hanging loose, no smoke from the chimney, no movement in the windows. Ray sat in the cockpit for a moment, listening to the ticking of his cooling engine and the distant rumble of artillery from the American side of the river. He was down, he was alive, he was behind enemy lines with a dead aircraft and a mission he couldn't complete, or could he? Ray climbed out of the cockpit and crouched beside the fuselage, scanning the area for threats. The field was empty. The farmhouse was silent. In the distance, he could hear vehicles moving on a road. German vehicles, probably, given the direction, but nothing close. He thought about his situation. The German artillery was less than half a mile away. He'd seen the positions clearly from the air. 4 guns in a ravine, camouflaged with netting, protected by earthen berms. He knew exactly where they were. He knew exactly how to destroy them. But his radio was in the plane, and the plane was dead. The batteries that powered the radio also powered the electrical system, and the electrical system was connected to the engine. No engine, no power, no power, no radio. He couldn't call in the strike. Unless... Ray looked at the farmhouse again. Then he looked at the road where he'd heard the German vehicles. Then he looked back at the ravine where the German guns were hidden. An idea was forming in his mind. It was a stupid idea. It was a reckless idea. It was the kind of idea that got people court-martialed or killed or both. But it was also the only idea he had. The farmhouse, as Ray had suspected, was abandoned. The family that lived there had fled, probably days ago, when the American artillery started falling on the east bank. They'd left in a hurry, dishes still in the sink, clothes scattered on the floor, a half-eaten loaf of bread going stale on the kitchen table. They'd also left a truck. It was parked behind the house, hidden under a canvas tarp, an Opel Blitz, the standard German army cargo truck. 3 tons, 6-cylinder engine, canvas-covered bed. There was a German army marking on the door, which meant it had probably been requisitioned from the family months ago and never returned. The Wehrmacht had a habit of borrowing civilian vehicles and forgetting to give them back. Ray walked around the truck checking for damage. The tires were good, worn but serviceable. The fuel tank was 3/4 full, according to the gauge visible through the driver's window. The engine compartment looked clean, no obvious leaks or broken components. Someone had been maintaining this vehicle, probably using it for supply runs until the artillery fire had driven everyone away. He pulled back the tarp and checked the cab. The keys were in the ignition. Ray almost laughed, of all the luck. But the truck was only half the equation. He still needed a way to communicate with the American guns. Ray went back to the grasshopper and retrieved his map, his binoculars, and the laminated card that listed the radio frequencies and call signs for the 285th Field Artillery. He also grabbed his emergency kit, a canvas bag containing flares, a first aid kit, a compass, and a chocolate bar that he'd been saving for a special occasion. Getting shot down behind enemy lines seemed special enough. The radio itself was useless, but the information on the card wasn't. If he could find a working radio, any radio, he could call in the strike. The American artillery had specific frequencies for emergency communications, channels that were monitored around the clock for exactly this kind of situation. If Ray could get on one of those channels, someone would hear him, and he knew exactly where to find a working radio. The German artillery position. The guns would have a field telephone at minimum, probably a radio as well. German artillery doctrine required communication with forward observers and rear echelon headquarters. Every battery had to be able to receive fire missions, report ammunition expenditure, and request resupply. That meant communications equipment that Ray could potentially use. If he could get to those guns, he could use their own communications equipment to call in an American strike on their position. It was insane. It was suicidal. It required him to drive a stolen German truck into a German artillery position, somehow neutralize the crews of 4 guns without getting killed, and then figure out how to use German communications equipment to contact American forces. Ray sat down on the running board of the Opel and thought it through. The Germans wouldn't be expecting an attack from behind. Their guns were pointed west, toward the American lines. Their defensive positions, if they had any, would be oriented to protect against infantry assault from the river. A single truck coming up the supply road from the east wouldn't trigger any alarms. He had a .45 pistol with 2 magazines, 16 rounds total. Not enough to fight his way through 20 men. But he wasn't planning to fight. He was planning to cause chaos. A truck full of fuel, driven into an ammunition dump, would cause a lot of chaos. Ray started doing calculations in his head. The drive from the farmhouse to the artillery position was about 400 yards, most of it on a winding dirt road. At 15 miles per hour, a reasonable speed for the terrain, that was about 1 minute of driving. 1 minute to reach the position, park the truck near the ammunition, and set it on fire. Then maybe 30 seconds to get clear before the fuel ignited. Then however long it took for the fire to reach the ammunition dump. Anywhere from 10 seconds to 2 minutes, depending on how the flames spread. Then the explosions, the chaos, the German gun crews running for cover. And somewhere in that chaos, he'd have to find a radio, figure out how to work it, and call in the strike. He had no backup, no support, and no plan beyond drive there and improvise. Ray got in the truck and started the engine. The Opel coughed twice, then settled into a steady idle. Ray sat for a moment listening to the engine, feeling the vibration through the steering wheel. The truck was in good condition. It would get him where he needed to go. Whether it would get him back was another question. He put the truck in gear and pulled out from behind the farmhouse. The road to the ravine was a narrow dirt track that wound through the hills, barely wide enough for the Opel's wheels. Ray drove slowly, partly because the road was rough and partly because he was trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do when he got there. He passed 2 German soldiers walking along the roadside, enlisted men, probably heading back to their unit. They glanced at the truck but didn't stop it. Why would they? It was a German truck, driven by a man in a leather flight jacket that could pass for a German uniform at a distance. As long as Ray didn't do anything suspicious, he was just another vehicle on a busy road. He kept driving. The artillery position appeared around a bend in the road, exactly where he'd seen it from the air. The 4 105mm guns were arranged in a line along the bottom of the ravine, their long barrels pointing west toward the American lines. Camouflage netting covered each gun, and earthen berms protected the crews from counter-battery fire. There were about 20 men visible, gun crews, ammunition handlers, a few officers. They were working steadily, loading shells, adjusting elevation, preparing for the next fire mission. A field telephone sat on a folding table near the command position, its wire running up the slope and disappearing over the ridge. Ray pulled the truck off the road and parked behind a stand of trees about 100 yards from the nearest gun. He sat for a moment, watching the Germans work, trying to see a way to do what he was planning. He couldn't shoot his way in. 16 rounds against 20 men was suicide. He couldn't bluff his way in. His German was limited to a few phrases he'd learned from prisoners, and the moment he opened his mouth, they'd know he was American. He couldn't wait for help. The American infantry was still pinned down on the east bank, and nobody knew where he was. But there was one thing he could do. He could create a distraction. The truck's cargo bed was covered with the canvas tarp he'd found at the farmhouse. Ray climbed into the back and found what he'd hoped to find: fuel cans. The German army, like all armies, moved fuel forward to keep its vehicles running. This truck had been carrying fuel when it was abandoned. 4 20-liter jerrycans, still full of gasoline. 80 liters of gasoline. Enough to create a very impressive fire. Ray's plan came together in pieces. Step 1. Drive the truck into the ravine, as close to the ammunition dump as possible. Step 2. Set the fuel cans on fire and bail out. Step 3. In the chaos of the explosion, reach the field telephone and call in the American strike. Step 4. Run like hell. It was a terrible plan. It had a dozen ways to go wrong, but it was the only plan he had. Ray opened one of the fuel cans and splashed gasoline across the floor of the cargo bed. He soaked a rag in fuel and wedged it into the mouth of another can as a makeshift fuse. He'd have maybe 30 seconds between lighting the fuse and the fire reaching the rest of the fuel. 30 seconds to park the truck, get out, and get clear. He got back in the cab and started the engine. The Germans didn't react when the truck came down the road into the ravine. Why would they? Trucks came and went all day, bringing ammunition, food, replacement parts. Another Opel Blitz was nothing unusual. Ray drove past the first gun, then the second, heading for the ammunition stack at the far end of the line. The shells were piled in wooden crates, covered with more camouflage netting. Hundreds of rounds of 105mm high explosive, enough to level a city block. He stopped the truck 20 feet from the ammunition stack. A German sergeant walked over, probably to ask what he was delivering. Ray smiled at him through the window, then lit a match and touched it to the gasoline-soaked rag. The flame caught immediately. Fire raced across the rag toward the open fuel can. Ray threw open the door and ran. He heard the sergeant shouting behind him, German words he didn't understand, probably something along the lines of, "What the hell is that American doing?" He heard other voices joining in, a rising chorus of confusion and alarm. Then he heard the fuel cans explode. The Opel Blitz went up like a Roman candle, a column of fire and black smoke that shot 50 feet into the air. The blast wave knocked Ray off his feet and sent him tumbling across the rocky ground. He rolled twice, came up on his knees, and kept running. Behind him, the ammunition dump was starting to cook off. The first shells exploded while Ray was still scrambling toward the field telephone. The blast was enormous, a wall of sound and heat that picked him up and threw him another 10 feet. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision blurred, but somehow still moving. The German gun crews were running in every direction. Some were trying to fight the fire. Others were trying to get away from the ammunition that was exploding all around them. Nobody was paying attention to the American pilot crawling toward the command post. Ray reached the field telephone. He grabbed the handset, spun the crank, and prayed that someone would answer. "Hier ist Artilleriestellung 7, a voice said on the other end. "Was ist los?" Ray had no idea what that meant. He didn't care. "This is Lieutenant Corcoran, United States Army," he shouted into the phone. "I need to speak to anyone who speaks English. This is an emergency. American officer. Emergency." There was a pause. Then, in heavily accented English, "Who is this? How did you get on this line?" "I don't have time to explain. I need you to relay a message to the American forces on the west bank of the Rhine. Tell them fire mission. Coordinates." "I will do no such thing. This is a German military line." The phone went dead. The German operator had hung up on him. Ray stared at the handset. His plan had failed. He'd blown up a truck, destroyed an ammunition dump, and probably killed half a dozen German soldiers. But he still couldn't call in the strike that would finish the job. Behind him, the remaining ammunition continued to explode. The gun crews had abandoned their positions, running for cover in the hills. The 4 105mm howitzers were still intact, but without crews or ammunition, they were useless. He'd succeeded. Sort of. The German guns weren't going to be firing on the American infantry anytime soon. But the mission wasn't complete. The guns could be remanned, resupplied, returned to action. To truly eliminate the threat, he needed American artillery to destroy the position. And he still had no way to call it in. Ray dropped the German field telephone and looked around the devastated position. The fires were burning themselves out. The explosions had stopped. Bodies lay scattered across the ravine. German soldiers killed by their own ammunition. And then he saw it. A radio. Not a field telephone. A real radio. A German Feldfeud.B unit, mounted on a wooden frame, sitting in the back of a half-destroyed command vehicle. The vehicle had been hit by shrapnel from the explosion, but the radio looked intact. Ray had trained on captured German radio equipment. He knew the frequencies the Germans used. More importantly, he knew the frequencies the Americans monitored for German transmissions. If he could get that radio working, he could transmit in the clear on a German frequency. American signals intelligence would pick up the transmission, and if he was very, very lucky, someone would realize that the American pilot speaking English on a German radio was not a trick, but a genuine call for help. He ran to the wrecked vehicle and pulled the radio from its mount. The power cable was intact. The antenna was bent but serviceable. He flipped the switches and heard static. The blessed static of a working radio. Ray tuned to a frequency he knew American intelligence monitored, a German artillery coordination channel that the 285th had been warned about in their briefings. He picked up the handset and started talking. This is First Lieutenant Raymond Corcoran, 285 Field Artillery Battalion, United States Army. I am transmitting on a captured German radio from coordinates. He read off the position from his map. There are 4 German 105mm guns at this location. I have destroyed the ammunition supply and neutralized the crews, but the guns are still intact, requesting immediate fire mission to destroy the position. I will mark the target with smoke if I can find any. He repeated the message 3 times. Then he sat back and waited. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then the first American shell came screaming in. It landed 200 yards short of the position. A ranging round, testing the coordinates. Ray grabbed the radio again. First round short. Adjust fire. Up 200. Left 50. Another shell. This one landed at the edge of the ravine, showering dirt and debris across the abandoned guns. Up 50. Fire for effect. The next salvo was a full battery. 4 155mm rounds landing almost simultaneously in the center of the ravine. The German guns disappeared in a cloud of smoke and fire. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but twisted metal and shattered earth. The mission was complete. Ray dropped the radio handset and sat down on the running board of the wrecked German command vehicle. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing. His uniform was torn and burned and covered in German blood. But he was alive, and the German guns were gone. The shelling had stopped. The ravine was a wasteland of craters and twisted metal. Where 4 German 105mm howitzers had stood that morning, there was nothing but debris. The earthen berms had been flattened. The camouflage netting was burning. The command post where Ray had found the radio was half buried in dirt from a near miss. He needed to move. The American infantry would be advancing now that the German guns were silenced, but there might still be German soldiers in the area, survivors from the gun crews, reinforcements coming to investigate the explosions, snipers who'd been watching the whole thing from the hills. Ray was still behind enemy lines, still alone, still armed with nothing but a .45 pistol and whatever rounds he had left. He checked his pistol. He hadn't fired a single shot. The chaos of the explosion had been enough. He'd never needed to pull the trigger. Ray stood up and looked around, trying to orient himself. The road he'd driven in on was blocked by burning debris. The hills to the east were steep, but climbable. If he could get to high ground, he might be able to see the American advance, figure out which direction to go. He started walking. The terrain was rough, rocky slopes covered in scrub brush, cut by ravines and dry stream beds. Ray moved carefully, stopping every few minutes to listen for sounds of pursuit. He heard nothing but the distant rumble of artillery, American artillery now, pounding German positions all along the east bank of the Rhine. After about half a mile, he reached a ridge overlooking a valley. Below him, he could see movement, vehicles, troops, the organized chaos of an army on the move. For a moment, his heart stopped. Then he saw the white stars on the vehicles, the olive-drab uniforms, the American flags flying from the command vehicles. The 89th Infantry Division. They'd broken through. Ray sat down on a rock and waited for them to reach him. He was still sitting there an hour later when the 1st American Infantry Patrol found him. The patrol was from the 89th Infantry Division, the same division that had been pinned down by the German artillery that morning. They'd heard the explosions from across the river and pushed forward to investigate. What they found was a single American officer, surrounded by destroyed German equipment, holding a German radio and grinning like a lunatic. "Who the hell are you?" the patrol sergeant demanded. "Lieutenant Corcoran, 285th Field Artillery. I was doing an observation mission when I got shot down." The sergeant looked at the devastation around them, the burning truck, the exploded ammunition, the shattered guns. "You did all this?" "I had help. The 155s did the heavy lifting at the end." "But you drove in here? By yourself?" "I stole a truck." The sergeant stared at him for a long moment. Then he started laughing. "Lieutenant, I don't know whether to recommend you for a medal or a Section 8. Can I get breakfast first? I missed breakfast." Colonel Harold Stein, commanding officer of the 285th Field Artillery Battalion, was waiting when Ray got back to the American lines. Stein was a regular Army man, a West Point graduate who believed in doing things by the book. When he'd heard that one of his observation pilots had crashed behind enemy lines, he'd assumed the man was dead or captured. When he'd heard that the same pilot had somehow destroyed a German artillery position and called in his own fire mission, he'd assumed the reports were exaggerated. Now, looking at the disheveled, burned, exhausted lieutenant standing in front of him, he wasn't sure what to assume. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Stein said slowly. "You were shot down by a sniper." "Yes, sir." "You crash-landed behind enemy lines?" "Yes, sir." "You stole a German truck?" "Yes, sir. It was just sitting there." "You drove the truck into a German artillery position?" "Yes, sir." "You set it on fire, destroyed their ammunition dump, and then used their own radio to call in an American artillery strike?" "Yes, sir." "That's about the size of it." Stein was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Lieutenant Corcoran, in 23 years of military service, that is the most irregular, unauthorized, undisciplined series of actions I have ever heard of." "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." "It also saved at least 50 American lives, eliminated a critical enemy position, and demonstrated the kind of initiative that wins wars." Stein extended his hand. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. I'm recommending you for the Silver Star." The story of Ray Corcoran's truck ride spread through the artillery community within days. It became one of those tales that soldiers told each other during lulls in the fighting. The pilot who wouldn't let a little thing like being shot down stop him from completing his mission. The official after-action report was more restrained. It noted that Lieutenant Corcoran had displayed exceptional initiative in adverse circumstances and had contributed materially to the success of the Rhine crossing operation. It mentioned the 4 destroyed German guns, the estimated 50 rounds of ammunition that had cooked off in the explosion, and the 16 German soldiers killed or wounded in the attack. What it didn't mention was the look on the faces of the German gun crews when they realized an American pilot had just driven a burning truck into their ammunition dump. Some things don't fit in after-action reports. Ray Corcoran flew 47 more observation missions before the war ended. He was shot at countless times, hit twice more, and never lost another aircraft. He learned to fly faster, stay lower, and never linger over the same spot for more than a few seconds. He also learned to check for keys before stealing enemy vehicles. "You never know when you might need one," he told his replacement when the war ended. Ray received the Silver Star for his actions at Oberwesel. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for his own safety. It didn't mention that he'd had no idea what he was doing when he started, or that half his plan had been made up on the spot, or that he'd been genuinely surprised when the German radio actually worked. Some things don't fit in citations either. After the war, Ray went home to Dayton, Ohio, and took a job as a crop duster. He said it was the closest thing to flying a grasshopper he could find in civilian life. Low, slow, and exciting enough to keep him interested. He flew crop dusters for 20 years until the arthritis in his hands made the stick too hard to grip. Then he retired to a small farm outside of town where he grew vegetables and told stories to anyone who would listen. The stories were always about other people. The brave soldiers he'd worked with, the infantry who'd crossed the Rhine under fire, the artillery crews who'd kept the guns firing day and night. He almost never talked about himself. When his grandchildren asked about his medals, he'd show them the Silver Star and say something vague about being in the right place at the right time. When they asked about the truck, he'd just smile and shake his head. That wasn't bravery, he'd say. That was just not knowing when to quit. Raymond Corcoran died in 1998 at the age of 79. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his career as a crop duster, and his family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a wife of 52 years who'd met him at a dance in 1945 and never let him go. It didn't mention the truck, but the men who'd been at Oberwesel remembered. At his funeral, a man Ray hadn't seen in 50 years stood up to speak. He'd been a private in the 89th Infantry Division, one of the soldiers pinned down on the east bank of the Rhine when the German guns were destroying his company. He'd watched the explosions in the ravine, not knowing what was happening, just grateful that the shells had stopped falling. "I didn't know Lieutenant Corcoran then," he said. "I didn't learn his name until years later. But I knew what he did. We all knew. The guns that were killing us just stopped, And then we heard our own artillery coming in, and we knew somebody had done something incredible. He paused, collecting himself. I've been alive for 53 years because of what that man did. My children exist because of what he did. His grandchildren are going to have cousins they never would have met because of what he did. The old soldier looked at the flag-draped coffin. Thank you, Lieutenant, for stealing that truck, for not knowing when to quit, for saving all of us who didn't even know we needed saving. He saluted, and somewhere, Raymond Corcoran probably smiled, because that was exactly the kind of thing he would have shrugged off. Just being in the right place at the right time, with a stolen truck and a burning fuse. And if you want to see more stories like this, check out one of these videos here. We'll see you next time.